Welcome to Glass Half Full with Leslie Krongold. She shares her stories, experiences, and knowledge of living and coping with a chronic health condition. Learn about tools and resources and hear inspirational interviews that help you to live a life filled with quality and dignity. With 2 decades of support group leadership, Leslie's ready to help you make lemonade out of life's lemons. Are you ready?
Hello and welcome to this podcast episode with my guest, Sandor Katz. He calls himself a fermentation revivalist, but he's a lot more than that, as you'll soon see. I first heard about Sandor because of his book, Wild Fermentation, which my partner, or spouse, read a few years ago. The book launched her avid curiosity about fermented foods, and soon there were fermented projects all over the house. A crock of sauerkraut, quasi-cheese in the toaster oven, sourdough starters on the counter, tanks of beer in the hallway closet, and a variety of unrecognizable beverages. Some of them were very tasty, and some were a bit too bitter for my taste buds. But it intrigued me enough to start attending fermentation events where I heard even more about Sandor Katz. And with the publication of his 3rd book, The Art of Fermentation, in 2012, I witnessed legions of fans speak about him with awe. This book has become the fermenter's Bible. Okay. And then I heard this little factoid that convinced me to learn more about Sandor, as well as fermentation. He is a man living with AIDS, and fermented foods have helped him with his healing process. Now you're talking my language. Someone with a chronic health condition, living life fully. So I don't know Sandor. We've never met. This is my first interview with someone I have never met and have no connection to. So I'm preparing for our Skype conversation. He lives in rural Tennessee. I felt like a real journalist. We had an email exchange, and he graciously accepted my invitation for an interview. Our conversation covers everything from AIDS to activism, gut health, micro-organisms, and role models. Healing can really encompass so many different avenues, different modalities: what you eat, how you eat, communing with nature, or focusing your energies on activism. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation.
So, as I told you in our email correspondence, I'm not a clinician. I certainly don't know, sort of much about, the specific disease that you're dealing with, or most people's diseases. But I have learned, a lot about, some ways in which, fermented foods can be helpful to people.
And really, I'd love for you to speak from your own experience. You were diagnosed with HIV in the early 90s, right?
This is true. But I'm also, I consider to be fermented foods, a piece of what keeps me healthy, but I also take HIV meds, and sometimes people misunderstand that and just assume that, I have cured, HIV using fermented foods. And, while I think that, good nutrition and probiotic stimulation, help the immune system in all kinds of ways, it generally does not amount to curing any specific disease, including HIV.
The things I practice certainly haven't cured me of my condition, but I find them to be definitely healing. And I personally don't take any drugs, and I read that for many years, you were against taking any sort of the, AZT and the earlier drugs that were available because you believed in clean living. And I was wondering what clean living meant, and did that coincide with your leaving New York and going to a more rural environment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say that when I tested positive in 1991, I was living in New York. I had a career in municipal government. Um, that year that I first tested positive is, it's really almost a blur when I think back on it. I mean, I certainly was involved in AIDS activism. I knew a lot of people who were living with HIV. I knew a lot of dynamic and vibrant and empowered people. But once it was, sort of my own health, I feel like I walked around in a daze for a year, just feeling something huge has to change in my life, and I can't even picture what it is. And I was going to yoga classes almost every day. I was meditating. I was definitely experimenting with diet, and at the time when I tested positive, I was already practicing a macrobiotic diet. But I really felt like something big has to change. And at the point when I met some people who lived in this community in Tennessee, and heard about its existence, was enchanted by stories I was hearing, that fit perfectly into the idea of looking to make a big change in my life. And this friend of mine who I met because she was my yoga teacher had started taking me on plant walks in parks in New York City, and I was getting interested in healing herbs. Sort of starting to drink some herbal infusions as regular health practice. And so, I mean, I feel like I was very open to the idea of moving to a rural place, having the opportunity to get to know plants more intimately, get more deeply into herbal medicine, learn about growing food, and harvesting things. And so, at the point when I moved to Tennessee from New York City, these things were all on my mind. I mean, I wouldn't say specifically that, I thought that like eating a particular way was going to save my life, but I thought that, sort of getting away from the stress of a more than full-time job, and New York City, living in a rural place, being involved in plants and getting my hands in the earth and growing food and eating that food, drinking fresh spring water. I mean, these were sort of all aspects of a lifestyle that I was hoping would be a healthier lifestyle than the, working to the point of exhaustion every day kind of lifestyle that I was living.
So I had read that you were concerned about the long-term toxicity of drugs at that time, and you didn't start taking antivirals until I guess you had a health crisis in '99.
Yeah, that's when I went on the meds. Yeah, I mean certainly in the early period when AZT was the only treatment that was available, at least as long as I was feeling healthy. I mean, I never really considered doing that because I had certainly watched people who had been healthy, start taking that drug and start getting really sick. And the early strategy with AZT was high doses, and now they give people doses that are a tiny fraction of the original doses and with other medications. But I didn't really consider that. And then when the new meds came out, I wasn't considering myself a sick person. It was hard for me to imagine, getting on the medical treadwheel and taking drugs every day, for an abstraction, something that showed up on my blood test, but wasn't like making me feel sick. And so, it really took, getting sick. Honestly, it took me a long time to realize I was sick. I mean, my earliest symptoms I really viewed as, psychological symptoms. I thought I was depressed. I thought that, my loss of appetite was related to that. And it took me a long time to recognize that I had, all of the classic symptoms of AIDS wasting.
Mm-hmm. And so, well, how's your current health?
My current health is really pretty strong and robust, and to some degree, I credit the drugs with that. But I'll tell you that most of the people who I meet who take the kind of drugs that I take, just live with chronic digestive problems, and I have just never experienced any of that. And that really makes me think that, alongside the meds, that the, kinds of foods that I eat that are, sort of so, tied up with good digestion, have kept my digestive process strong.
Well, that's a certainly good segue to talk about fermented foods. So I've read that, you've always enjoyed pickles from your youth. You grew up in New York, but you didn't start actually playing around with fermented foods until you moved out to Tennessee, right?
That is correct.
And so how does that coincide with your healing? How did it did it come after you were you had your health crisis?
My interest in fermented foods certainly developed before my health crisis did. I mean, in my first year my interest in fermented foods, I would say, goes back to my childhood. And, as a kid growing up in New York City, I loved sour pickles. And, they just were a favorite food of mine. And I always have been, drawn to the lactic acid flavor. It's not that any of the adults in my life were talking about fermentation. It's not like my grandparents had a fermentation practice or my parents, but I was drawn to this flavor of fermentation. And I mentioned earlier that during the later period that I was in New York, I was following a macrobiotic diet, and macrobiotics was definitely where I first heard about the healing and medicinal potential of fermented foods, because macrobiotics places a great emphasis on, eating a little bit of pickles at the beginning of each meal, as a digestive stimulant. And once I started thinking about that, I started observing that whenever I would eat these pickles that I had always loved, or sauerkraut or kimchi or other kinds of fermented vegetables, that I could literally feel my salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And so in a really tangible way, I started associating these foods with getting my digestive juices flowing.
Mm-hmm. So how has your diet changed? What percentage of your diet actually consists of fermented foods?
I'll say that I really don't at this point, follow any particular kind of dietary ideology. My primary dietary ideology would be, variety and seasonality. And I have a beautiful garden, and to the extent that I can, I eat out of my garden. But I don't think any one kind of food is the best food or the answer. I mean, I love fermented foods. I've been teaching people about fermented foods and promoting fermented foods and beverages, but that doesn't mean that because fermented foods are good, that, cutting out everything else and eating exclusively fermented foods is somehow better. I think that, diversity is probably the highest value in diet, and eating lots of different kinds of plants, eating lots of different kinds of ferments. So, I eat lots of different kinds of food. I love eggs. I'd say half the time my breakfast consists primarily of eggs, but, certainly not exclusively.
I know about fermented foods being good for your gut health. How else has the consumption of fermented foods been healing for you?
Well, okay. Part of the answer of this has to be we don't know. Until the beginning of the new millennium, science had no way of studying bacteria beyond individual organisms that could be cultivated in a dish. So, our ability to sort of look at and understand the dynamics of interactions between microbial communities is really a brand new thing. Mm-hmm. So, it's pretty well. So basically, each of our bodies are host to something like 1 trillion bacteria. Increasingly evolutionary biologists are coming to the conclusion that all life is evolved from bacteria. The flip side of this is that no form of life has ever lived without bacteria. It's certainly not unique to human beings. Every animal, every plant, every fungus is populated by bacteria and has never lived without them, and frankly probably couldn't live without them. So in our own human bodies, we're learning extraordinary things about what bacteria do for us. So it certainly a part of it is our ability to effectively digest food and assimilate nutrients from our food, and that's one big piece of it. Bacteria in our intestines actually synthesize essential nutrients for us, so we don't have to find them in our food. What we think of as our immune system is mostly the work of bacteria in our intestines. Increasingly, we're realizing that serotonin and other chemical compounds that determine how we think and how we feel are regulated by bacteria in ways that we don't fully understand. The abilities of the cells of our livers to regenerate is regulated by bacteria in our intestines. I mean, almost every aspect of our health and well-being is related to these bacteria. So historically, nobody had to think about, restoring gut biodiversity, but, for the last most of 100 years, we've been living with, in the midst of what I call the war on bacteria, and our bodies are battlegrounds in the war against bacteria. And, we all have abundant chemical exposure frequently to chemicals designed to kill bacteria. And, that would include antibacterial cleansing products, which have just been outlawed by the USDA, but we've all been using them for a couple of decades. And, they're found in private homes and public institutions everywhere. Antibiotic drugs. I'm certainly not against the use of antibiotic drugs. I probably wouldn't be here were it not for the miracle of antibiotic drugs, but everybody agrees that they're overused. Mm-hmm. As a result of their overuse in healthcare and even more so in agriculture, we're finding rising levels of antibiotic compounds in our water table. So we're all ingesting low levels of antibiotics every day, no matter how pristine the source of our water. And then the chlorine that's in our drinking water in the first place is also put there to kill bacteria. So we have all of this chemical exposure to kill bacteria, which thankfully doesn't kill all the bacteria. Otherwise, it would kill us. But it diminishes biodiversity. We think about biodiversity as an important concept, out there, having to do with, wolves and whales and trees. And I mean, that's all important. I mean, right. I don't mean to diminish that in any way, but biodiversity is really just as important of a concept looking inside of us. And so, what's the relationship between eating bacteria-rich foods and these bacteria that help us? I mean, we don't exactly know. There's some sort of an elaborate interaction that happens between the bacteria we ingest and the bacteria that are in residence in our intestines. It's a highly competitive environment. What we do know about bacteria, though, is that, unlike us, unlike plants, unlike fungi, bacteria are genetically flexible and can exchange genetic information. So presumably, the interaction between the bacteria we ingest and the bacteria that are in residence or in our intestines is some sort of a genetic exchange.
So how does that trickle down to someone who, in my community, people with myotonic dystrophy, which I know you know nothing about, but one of the major symptoms people complain about is GI stress. And there's also incredible amount of weakness and fatigue. And in many people, there's a cognitive sort of apathy, personality issues. But GI stress is a big one. And most people will never become avid fermenters because of a lot, variety of reasons. Mostly just the energy and motivation it would take to start, the little projects and everything. What would you recommend? I mean, I know I've heard people talk about, they bought some probiotic or prebiotic pill supplement that they take while still consuming a diet that I I would judge as not very healthy. Am I putting you on the spot by asking you, what would you recommend for someone in that situation?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think that probiotics do have their place, but I think that, mostly I would conceptualize the benefits of ingesting bacteria as being promoting biodiversity. And, most probiotic capsules, they might have 5 billion cells in them, but it's 5 billion copies of a single cell or of two or three. So, I think that fermented foods are a much more, effective source of diverse bacteria, because all traditional fermented foods involve these broad communities of organisms rather than singular organisms. Single microorganisms are really a human technological achievement. And in the natural world, in our bodies, microorganisms are always found in communities. So, I would say that foods are probably a superior source of probiotics than capsules. Mm-hmm. If you don't have the motivation or the time to make them yourselves, certainly it is possible to purchase, good quality living fermented foods and beverages. I mean, you have to be a savvy consumer. Certainly the most commonly available products and the products that you find, sort of in widest distribution, they're heat processed. I mean, your sauerkraut sitting on the shelf in the supermarket is canned. It's heat processed, and that's what gives it that shelf stability. A living product always has to, that's sealed in a jar, always has to be in a refrigerator. Otherwise, it'll build up carbon dioxide and pressure and potentially explode, or the juice will ooze out, or whatever. So as a practical matter, these things are always found in the refrigerator, and I would say you'll find better products if you go to a natural foods market than at a mainstream supermarket. But fermented vegetables, fermented dairy products, different kinds of lightly fermented beverages, these are all excellent sources of probiotic bacteria. And because they need to stay refrigerated, once they're put in a jar, they're kind of pricey. So, I mean, I would also just sort of challenge the idea that it's hard to make them. Really, like if you take, 2 pounds of vegetables and 10 minutes of your time, you can have a quart of fermented vegetables that, would cost you $15 or $20. So, it's really easy. I mean, all you do is chop or grate the vegetables to create surface area, lightly salt them. There's no magic number of salt, just salt it to taste. Then what I like to do is just get in there with my hands and squeeze it for 5 minutes. What you're doing is kind of bruising the vegetables and breaking down cell walls and helping them give up their juice. And the significance of that is that the condition you're trying to create, what prevents molds from growing and enables lactic acid bacteria to dominate on the vegetables, is getting them submerged. If you chop up vegetables and leave them in a bowl exposed to air, it's going to become engulfed with mold over time. But when you stuff them into a jar and you've gotten them juicy and get them submerged under their own juices, that's when the lactic acid bacteria dominate. And, I know that sometimes people project anxiety about bacteria onto this process, but let me just say that according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there has never been one single documented case of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables. This is about as safe as food gets.
And you have some really great videos, YouTube videos about how to actually create that jar of vegetables, and I'll include a link to that, because for many people, once they realize, okay, this is something they can do. It's not expensive. It's not, you don't have to get a prescription. It's natural. If they have that motivation, they may be able to achieve it. And, but there are some people who wouldn't have the energy of the cutting, the chopping of the vegetable.
Yeah, I understand that.
I have 2 other questions that are a little off this path. I was wondering if there was anything else you wanted to say about fermented foods, about your healing process. before I go on to these other two questions?
Well, I mean, I would just add that, these foods are incredibly delicious. I mean, most of the world's major delicacies are products of fermentation. You walk into any gourmet food store and what you see are products of fermentation. They're practical from a standpoint of food preservation as well. Sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, yogurt, cheese, cured meats. These have really all been, strategies to preserve, the overabundance that comes with certain seasons to get people through the seasons of relative scarcity. So there's just a lot of, practical benefits to fermentation. And among them, are these living bacteria that can, really, help digestion, help overall immune function, help mental health. And, anybody can benefit from that. Like, you don't have to be living with a chronic disease, but if you're living with a chronic disease, then it can be especially helpful.
I was especially moved by the last chapter in Wild Fermentation, and I'm reading not your newest edition, so I have no idea how much,
Okay, right, and this is and just to let people in on it, that just a few weeks ago, a revised edition of my original book, Wild Fermentation, was released. But so let's hear it. But chances are, I kind of think in that last chapter, most of the significant stuff stayed substantially the same.
So, as someone diagnosed with a chronic health condition at a young age, you were forced to think about death and conscious living before, most average people do. I mean, and some people never really think about it, or at least never speak about it. And I really appreciated what you had to say about fermentation and composting as they relate to the cyclical nature of life. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, I mean, I was 29 years old when I tested HIV positive. My mother died a couple of years before that, so I was, confronted. I was confronted with death, with her death, and then, testing HIV positive, and sort of watching all of these, young people who were my age pass certainly gave me pause and forced me to think about my own mortality. And I think that, I think that's one of the things that sort of drew me to, moving to a rural area and being involved in growing things, was the idea of being closer to the cycles of life and death and the cycles of nature. But when I got involved with fermentation, it really kind of fleshed that out for me, if you will, because I just realized to what a degree, fermentation is an essential link in the cycle of life and death, because it's really the cycle of life and death and fermentation. And fermentation is what, it's microorganisms, acting upon, dead plant and animal material in order to, recycle nutrients and basically, take the remnants of death and recycle them for further forms of life. And, when we sort of expand our view of it, fermentation isn't something that just happens, in kitchens and cellars, in crocks and other kinds of vessels. Fermentation is what's happening in the compost pile too. And that's the recycling of the, of the waste from the kitchen, the parts of vegetables you can't use, the things that go bad, the weeds from the garden, recycling them back into humus, which, nourishes further plant growth. And, so I think that, fermentation is really, integral in the whole cycle of life and death. Absolutely.
Yeah, it just was a particularly poignant chapter for me. Okay, my final question, and I wasn't aware of your involvement with ACT UP and AIDS activism until I read the transcript from the oral history project that you linked to.
Okay.
Yeah, that
you did your homework.
But anyhow, so I was wondering what role this early activism played, and the fact that you were involved in ACT UP before you were actually diagnosed positive, what role that played for you in your journey with the illness? Are you still an AIDS activist? How does the activism change as you age? Because, not just with AIDS, there's certainly other conditions, cancer, where some people choose to become really super involved and, go to Washington and meet with legislatures. It is a role that some people, when diagnosed, they naturally fall into, and then it's something that's alien to other people. They never have the desire. So I was wondering, how was that a coping mechanism for you?
Well, interestingly, I got involved in AIDS activism before I tested positive myself. So it's certainly that's not what got me involved in it. But I think that the fact that I was involved in AIDS activism and through that, sort of got to know so many, empowered people who, we're making a difference, and we're not, like laying at home in bed feeling sorry for themselves, that we're, kind of trying to do something, really. By the time I tested positive, it just gave me role models. And it really kept me from, just, getting excessively morbid and just like imagining that this was, going to kill me and that I should just give up. So, at this stage in life, I actually have not remained super active, in AIDS activism. Sometimes I'll, sort of hear about something going on and get involved with it, but I have not been, I haven't been, regularly involved in that or deeply involved in that.
If you'd like to learn more about Sandor, please check out his website. In the podcast show notes on the Glass Half Full website, I have links to his books and his website where he has links to YouTube videos. He'll show you the simple steps to create your own fermented vegetables. Thanks again, Sandor, for your time, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Let's toast to good gut health. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Glass Half Full. Leslie invites you to leave a rating and review on iTunes. This helps spread the word to others dealing with chronic health issues. For show notes, updates, and more, visit the website glasshalffull.online. Glasshalffull.online.